My guest today is Peter Phippen, UK architect and author, co-author with Stephen Judd and Mary Marshall of a wonderful and excellent book that served us well in this report called Design for Dementia, which is the name of the book. And I recommend it to anybody interested in designing for dementia in residential settings. Peter, welcome to the interview.
Thank you, John.
My first question is, what motivated you to accept Mary Marshall's invitation to write this book with her and with Stephen Judd?
Well, John, we had jobs designing buildings for older people, and I knew dementia was becoming a more important issue, and we wanted to do it well. And the way to do it well is to find out what other people are doing and try and understand why some of their efforts are successful and others aren't. So it was really as simple as that. I mean, whatever buildings I was designing, I always tried to have a good look round at what was happening, not only in this country, but in Europe and in the States as well.
Would you consider that research?
I didn't really think of it as research, but I suppose it was research, yes. I mean, it was what I wanted to do to ensure that we were doing things well, to the best of our ability, and to in accordance with the best current practice.
Did you have a chance when you were visiting these many residential settings and designed and operated by others, did you have a chance to interview people, to observe? What kind of methods did you use to delve into the buildings themselves?
Well, remember, it was a sort of whistle-stop tour. We probably spent a morning looking at one scheme and an afternoon looking at another. But we had a good interpreter. We spoke mainly to staff. I suppose that was partly time constraints and partly the language problem. The staff often spoke English, the residents didn't necessarily. So we probably got a management side view of things, but I mean, you can tell whether this building or these buildings are successful by the attitude of the residents. I mean, how do they look? How do they seem? Do they seem happy? Are they content? Are they moving around freely? You get a feel for the place and whether it's really working and whether it's a happy place.
Your description includes not only the physical setting, but also the operations and something about the staff and how they work. Was that something that you set out to determine when you started the project?
Yes, we wanted the whole picture. I mean, that was why I didn't just go on my own as an architect with other architects. I went with the manager of Hammond Care, an organisation that was really in the forefront of dementia care in Australia.
Our co-author, Richard Fleming, was an important person at Hammond Care in the beginning of Hammond Care's operations.
Yes, he was. I mean, Richard Fleming, I think, started what can best described as a revolution with the CADE unit, which, really focused our minds on what was important, what the central issue was.
Is that something, when you say focused your minds on what was interesting and what the important issues were, looking back, how would you describe what the important issues were in the larger sense?
Well, if I wanted to find one word that was perhaps most important, it would be a familiar environment. And by a familiar environment, I mean a home-like environment. Now, there are important things, interaction with other people and so on, and obviously you have to accommodate that. But I don't think people are going to be happy is perhaps too strong a word, or at least relaxed in an environment that isn't familiar and isn't home-like. And the challenge is to design a building which can be run efficiently and properly, and yet give people that feeling of security that comes from familiarity.
Would you say that familiarity always means furniture and decor that's like when people were younger, or is there a way of creating this familiarity through design in a creative and innovative way?
Well, there might be, but I've got my doubts about it. I mean, familiarity is terribly important, and familiarity, of course, goes back a number of years for somebody in their 80s or 90s. We had a neighbour to lunch, an 88-year-old neighbour the other day. It was his 88th birthday. And he'd been to the house, but he hadn't been in the bathroom. And he went to the bathroom this time. And he came out and said, "You ought to put labels on those taps telling people to lift them rather than turn them." And that's the sort of thing that, you need to be aware of. You need to use the sort of taps, the sort of ironmongery, sort of windows and everything that people are familiar with.
Windows, taps, door handles. What about, is there anything in the kitchen that you saw that you sort of said, well, that's familiar versus something difficult to handle?
No, I don't remember that, but it is important, because I do think that you need to allow people to retain their existing skills, and those existing skills, I mean, in the nature of things, they're going to, I suspect, be more women than men in any institution like this. Sorry, it's wrong to call it an institution, in any environment like this. So things like working in the kitchen and so on is very, very important. I mean, it is for men as well. I mean, I realise that, we live in a society where men and women both undertake domestic tasks these days. So that's important. Enable people to retain their existing skills.
Does designing or including gardens fit into that?
Definitely. Yes, I mean, we made a point always of having raised beds so that people could work in them as they get older. I wish my own garden had raised beds at the moment. I would find gardening much more pleasant.
Did you see residences or programs that included gardens and gardening as a major effort?
There was one Australian scheme I remember quite well, where, if I remember, they had some chickens, and they certainly had an old car which the men could go and sit in. Perhaps the women could go and sit in. Because of my age, I'm a little bit sexist, I'm afraid, so I tend to think of the sexes as behaving differently. But of course, as the years go by, they become more similar, and as many women, if not more, drive than men.
Well, I think you're talking about Adards in Tasmania and war.
That's right. Yes, that rings a bell.
And you were impressed with that garden?
I was impressed with that idea. I didn't actually see that scheme.
So, home-like, you were describing details. Is there something more plan-related or design-related that would lead to having a home-like familiar environment?
Well, the thing that is important, and it's important in the design of all buildings, but people don't necessarily take it seriously, is legibility. It needs to be fairly obvious how you find your way around. And the obvious thing is to have a short corridor, and at one end of it a light area which denotes that something's happening. So you come out of your door and you are drawn towards the light because you sense something might be happening there. I mean, I did see one very impressive building by a well-known architect, dementia-specific care home, and the corridors were so long that the ends were almost lost in the mist. I mean, you would have no idea where you were when you came out into that corridor. It's very important, I think, that the legibility of the environment, things that give you clues apart from signs, perhaps. I mean, perhaps a piece of furniture that juts out into the corridor, for example, denotes a common room. Perhaps it spans the common room, so that you're aware visually by what you see of where you can go and what you can do.
So in a sense, that's one of the components of home and of house that we live in all the time, that you live in, that I live in. Namely, where we live is a place that we know where things are and how to get to places.
Well, I suppose we learn it, of course. For someone with dementia, it's different because they have to discover it each time.
So if the building is legible, sometimes also called naturally mapped, where all the information that they need to find their way is embedded in the environment, that makes it easy each time to find their way and for it to be legible. Is that right?
It does, yes, definitely.
So when you finished your research, these whistle-stop half-day visits, did you go back to an office and did you describe some of what you learned to your partners and to other members of your firm?
I was well known for boring people with slideshows, John, so I've no doubt that I gave a number of presentations to people. And I was fueled up, I'm an enthusiast by nature, so I was fueled up by what I'd seen and how things ought to be and how things could be better. So yes, I went back and talked. And I gave a number of other talks at universities and other places on what design for dementia was about.
So really, part of what happened was, as a result, you did training.
Yes. Well, I disseminated knowledge. Let's overstate it. I disseminated knowledge.
Yes. Well, the dissemination of knowledge is vital. And one of the elements of this ADI report is about design training and design education and how important it is, and design for dementia particularly. Did you find when you were giving these talks at universities, other than that they said, I doubt really they said you were boring, but I understand, that there was a reception around people interested, or there were certain types of people who were more interested in this field than others?
I think the sort of people who invited me to talk were interested. I think that some of them were perhaps surprised that an architect could be so interested in the actual nature of design. People think that architects like designing nice buildings, and designing for people with dementia isn't about designing a nice building that's going to get in the magazines because it's a great piece of architecture. It's a much more humble occupation than that. It's recreating familiarity. I mean, the one watchword I keep coming back to is familiarity. You're not out to create something new. You're out to create something familiar to the people who are going to live there. And the interesting thing, of course, is that the things that they're familiar with change over time. So what they were familiar with 20 years ago is not what they're familiar with older people are not familiar with now. So there has to be, in a way, an upgrading of things to take that into account, I think.
And the ability in the design to upgrade.
Yes. Well, and I mean, it's a management issue at a small scale. The whole idea of flexibility built into the design is important, but not necessarily easy to achieve. I mean, there's an interesting point that we got into designing for older people through a scheme that one of my partners did at Stevenage. It was the first sheltered housing in this country, and it was knocked down. And one of the reasons it was knocked down was because of the there were shared bathrooms, shared WCs, and those standards in 1965 or whenever, yes, 1965 or so, that was acceptable. It's certainly not acceptable now. Everyone expects an ensuite. Most people expect a shower, you know. And I'm not sure where we are on showers in this country, because we were probably late adopters of showers. We stuck to a bath for a very long time. So now more and more people accept a shower and only want a shower.
Would you say, because you said that it's not designing, magazine-ready buildings, but would you say that there is an aesthetic that goes along with this issue of familiarity, or is there no aesthetic at all?
Well, the aesthetic is the one of the environment that people are familiar with. So in a way, one's trying to replicate something, which of course is not what architects really like doing. But there is an aesthetic, but as I was saying earlier, remember the aesthetic changes over the years. What people were familiar with 20 years ago is not what they're familiar with now. I mean,
but would you say that as an architect, when you were designing buildings with this intent of familiarity, that there was a kind of aesthetic that emerged in the way you designed, in the way you thought about things?
I'm not really sure, John, to be honest. I mean, as far as the external appearance is concerned, then obviously it must fit in with the existing environment. It mustn't stand out. I mean, one thing I hate is that you drive along a road and they're set back well from the road, as opposed to all the other buildings which are virtually at the curbside.
So one of the aesthetic elements might be fitting in.
Definitely, absolutely, definitely. Yeah.
That's a pretty important aesthetic point.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want something. I mean, just think that it's something you're going to be taken to, and you don't want to be taken to something that is. It may be beautiful in a beautiful landscape setting up a long drive, but that's not what you're used to. I mean, you're reluctant to be leaving home, and here you are being taken to this new place, which looks, I don't know, may look threatening. It may look inviting in a sense, but I suspect it's threatening.
Isn't that interesting? So first of all, thank you so much for participating and for disseminating your knowledge in this interview. I have one last question, which is, if you could write or design a poster that was going to go on the wall of every architect, designer, operator, builder, developer of housing or environments for dementia, what would that poster say?
Remember, everyone would rather be at home.
That's a pretty powerful poster. Peter, thank you so much for participating in this effort. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure that those who see this video, which hopefully will be very often, will see it as interesting and will welcome all of your lessons. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John, for inviting me, and I hope what you say is true.